The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 came off the tow truck like something dragged out of a river. Rust had eaten through both quarter panels. The paint was gone in sheets. The windshield carried a crack that ran almost to the top. The tires were flat. Dex Corin stepped out of the shop bay, looked at the car, looked at the man who had come to claim it, worn canvas jacket, rented flatbed at the curb, and said it loud enough for the whole bay to hear. "You know we sell new ones, right?" The laughter came fast and easy. The man signed the release form, folded it into his jacket pocket and did not look up. Then he walked to the car and put his hand on the roof, just his palm, flat against the metal. His eyes moved down the length of the body slowly. The way you read something you need to understand exactly right. They assumed he couldn't afford better. He hadn't said a word to suggest otherwise. His name was Brennan Wick. He was 38 years old. For 11 years, he had been one of the top authentication specialists at Barrett-Jackson, which was the kind of job that sounded boring to anyone who hadn't seen what it actually involved, standing in front of a vehicle that might be worth $400,000 or $40,000 and knowing which one it was before anyone told you. Reading a VIN through surface rust with a flashlight and your own eyes, listening to an engine fire and hearing the year in the combustion cycle, running your thumb along a seam weld and knowing from the pressure and the texture whether it had been touched since the factory. He was good at it, in the way that certain people are good at things that cannot be entirely taught. He had learned the technical side, the documentation, the provenance chains, and the auction records. But the part that made him valuable, the part that made a collector in Phoenix fly him out to look at a single car for 40 minutes, was something that had been there before any of it. His wife Mara had called it his X-ray vision. She said it the first time they met, at a friend's backyard gathering, when he stopped mid-conversation to look at a 1957 Bel Air parked across the street, and told her without being asked that it had been respayed at least twice, and the engine was not original. She had laughed. 2 months later, she told him she'd looked it up, and he was right. They had 7 years together. Petra was born in the 5th year. Mara died on a Tuesday morning, in March 3 years ago, on a road Brennan had driven 100 times. A driver ran a red light at 40 miles an hour, and Mara's car took the impact on the driver's side, and that was the end of it. Petra was 4 years old, and did not understand yet. And then she was 5, and understood too much. Brennan submitted his resignation to Barrett-Jackson 14 days after the funeral. No explanation, no notice period discussion, no plan. He found a garage to rent in a neighborhood 20 minutes outside the city, put out word through 2 people he trusted, and started taking restoration work on a case-by-case basis. It was enough to live on. It was not enough to be comfortable. He did not care about comfortable. The night before he drove to Whitver Automotive, he was sitting at the kitchen table after Petra had gone to sleep, scrolling through a restoration forum he checked maybe once a week. The listing had been posted 6 hours earlier. One photograph, taken on a phone. Bad angle, low light. Most people would have seen a junked car. Brennan saw the C-pillar ratio. He saw the roofline curve. He saw, in the lower left corner of the frame, a shadow that was not a shadow, a partial VIN stamp pressed into the firewall, half obscured, showing 2 characters he recognized. He sat with it for about 30 seconds. Then he placed a bid of $800 at 11:14 at night, went to bed, and slept. Cora Whitver had not inherited the company because she was the oldest. She was the only child. Her father, Gerald Whitver, had built the company across 30 years from a single dealership into a regional automotive group with 11 locations and a restoration division. That was the thing he was actually proud of. Gerald knew every car in the collection by name, which was not a metaphor. He had names for them, history for them, the kind of relationship with objects that most people only have with people. When he died, Cora was 29 and had been working in the company's finance division for 4 years. She was good at the financial side. She understood acquisition costs and margin structures, and what a portfolio looked like when it was healthy versus when it was performing healthy while quietly deteriorating. What she did not have, and knew she did not have, was her father's feel for the cars themselves. She had grown up around them. She did not speak their language. Dex Corin had been head of technical operations for 11 years. He had been there before Cora, which he never said directly but which he communicated in small ways, constantly. When Cora inherited the CEO role, Dex became the person she depended on for everything the car's required: assessments, restorations, the maintenance of the heritage collection, and the inventory decisions that came with running an operation that old. 18 months before Brennan Wick signed a release form in the back lot, Dex had brought Cora a proposal. The storage inventory was creating costs, insurance, space, maintenance overhead on vehicles that were not being actively used or sold. A structured liquidation program, he called it. Clean out the non-strategic assets, free up the floor space, simplify the books before the next investor review. It was a reasonable proposal. Cora approved it in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes and signed the authorization that afternoon. What Dex had not put in the proposal was the mechanism. The vehicles would be listed on the company's internal auction platform with a 48-hour window. The minimum bids were set by Dex's team. The only party that ever submitted competing bids was an LLC registered in Delaware, an entity whose owner, if anyone had looked, was the husband of Dex's wife's sister. 6 vehicles had moved through this system without incident. 6 vehicles that Dex had assessed as low value, posted at low prices, and watched land in friendly hands for prices that left room for a quiet resale. The Camaro was supposed to be the 7th. Dex had looked at it the way he looked at all of them: old, deteriorated, a storage problem. His estimate was that it might resell for a few $1,000s in parts. Maybe $8,000 to $10,000 to the right buyer if someone cleaned it up. He posted it at $800, which was where he always started, and set the window for 48 hours. He went home for the weekend. On Monday morning, he opened the confirmation email and saw a name he did not recognize. He checked the vehicle file again. Still nothing that concerned him. An old Camaro. He approved the transfer and moved on. He would spend the next 20 days trying to undo that decision. The flatbed truck backed into the lot at 7:43 in the morning. Brennan had driven it from the rental yard himself. He was alone. The Camaro was already sitting at the edge of the lot, where the lot staff had moved it out of the way, out of sight, the way you put things you want to stop looking at. Dex came out when he saw the truck. He brought 2 of his senior technicians with him, which was not something he normally did for a transfer pickup. He reviewed the release form while Brennan stood next to the Camaro, and then he looked at the car, and then he said what he said. The laughter moved through the bay. It had a specific texture, not hostile, which would have been cleaner. It was the laughter of people who found a situation self-explanatory, who felt that the car and the man and the truck added up to something obvious, something that confirmed what they already thought about certain kinds of people and certain kinds of choices. One of the senior technicians leaned against the bay door. "Man's getting a project." He said it not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Dex watched Brennan begin to prep the car for loading. The way he moved was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect wrong, in the sense of not matching the picture. You learned things in 11 years of watching people interact with cars. You learned that the people who didn't know what they were doing moved cautiously, with the specific carefulness of someone who knows they might make a mistake. The people who did know moved with a different kind of attention, focused, economical, certain of where their hands were going before they got there. Brennan moved like the second kind. Dex watched him open the hood, watched him take a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and lean in at a specific angle. The light aimed not at the engine block, but at the upper left corner of the firewall. He held it there for a moment. Then he closed the hood. Cora came through the side gate at the far end of the lot on her way to the parking structure. She stopped. She stood at the edge of the scene for a moment: the truck, the car, the cluster of technicians, the man, and then she kept walking. Loop Sanders stood in the door of the main bay and watched all of it without moving. He had been with the company for 22 years. He had been watching Dex Corrin for about 18 months. He had done something about it once, 6 months ago, typed a careful email to Cora's address, laying out what he had observed, the pattern of the listings, the timing, the same buyer appearing over and over. He had hit send and waited. Cora never responded. He had assumed she either hadn't received it or hadn't cared. He would later find out which one it was. He watched the man work the loading straps under the frame with a practiced efficiency that had no business being there, and he filed it away. The garage Brennan rented was on the backside of an industrial block, wedged between a sheet metal shop and a place that did custom upholstery. The overhead door was heavy and stiff, and he had learned to prop it open with a length of angle iron. Inside, it smelled like solvent and metal, and, in the corner, near the workbench, the particular faint sweetness of the pine cleaner Petra used when she mopped the floor on Saturday mornings, which was her assigned task, which she did without complaint and without rushing. 10 days after the pickup, the Camaro was on a 2-post lift with all 4 wheels off. The interior was out seats, door cards, carpet, all labeled and stacked against the far wall. The dashboard had been photographed from 6 angles before removal. On the wall next to the lift, Brennan had taped a hand-drawn diagram of the car, divided into 43 sections, each one marked with a color code: green for solid, yellow for repairable, red for replacement. There were 6 red marks. That was fewer than he had expected. Lupe Sander came through the overhead door at 2 in the afternoon. He drove a 1982 Buick Riviera that had started running badly 3 weeks ago. He'd taken it to 3 shops. None of them had been comfortable diagnosing a car that old, which was not something he said, but something Brennan would have understood anyway. Brennan came out from under the lift. He listened to Lupe, described the symptoms: a rough idle, a hesitation at low RPM, a smell he couldn't place. Brennan nodded once, said nothing, and walked to the Buick. He opened the driver's door and started the engine. He sat in the driver's seat with the door open and listened for about 45 seconds. Then he got out, walked around to the front, and without opening the hood, put his palm against the valve cover on the passenger side. He stood there for a moment. Then he went around to the driver's side and did the same. He walked back. Float in the primary is sticking, probably a piece of debris. Could also be the needle seat starting to wear. Either way, it's the carburetor. I can have it back to you in 2 days. Lupe looked at him. You didn't open the hood. I didn't need to. Lupe looked at the Buick and then looked at the Camaro on the lift. He walked over to it slowly. He was not a small man, and he moved with the deliberateness of someone who had spent a lot of years on concrete floors. He looked at the diagram on the wall. He looked at the numbered tags on the stacked components. Then he looked at the block, where Brennan had marked something on the upper right corner of the firewall, in red wax pencil. 2 letters, D and Z. He stood there for a moment. Where did you work before this? Different place. How long? 11 years. Lupe looked at the 2 letters again. You know what you have. It was not a question. I know, Brennan said. Lupe turned around. His expression had not changed. It rarely did, but something behind it had shifted slightly. The way a room changes when a window opens. Dex doesn't, but when he figures it out, he will come for it. Brennan wiped his hands on a shop rag. I know that too. Lupe looked at him for a moment more. Then he went back to his Buick and got in the passenger seat and waited for Brennan to start the work. The announcement came from Whitford's Investor Relations office. A strategic capital raise, a partnership with a private equity group that specialized in heritage automotive brands. The terms of the deal required an independent audit of all asset disposals in the previous 24 months. It was standard due diligence. It was announced on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Dex had pulled every file from the liquidation program and read through them looking for anything that would not survive scrutiny. He found 6 files that were explainable with some workload valuations on legitimately deteriorated vehicles, defensible, if not precisely accurate. Then, he found the 7th file. He read it for the first time, as someone who now needed to defend it, which was different from how he had read it when he created it. He called up the VIN on the company's internal heritage database, the archive Gerald Whitford had built over 30 years, scanned documents and production records, and correspondence going back to the 1960s. It took him 11 minutes to find the entry. The car was not a standard Z28. It was a prototype, one of 2 DZ302 development vehicles, built in 1969 for performance testing, never released to the public, retained by the manufacturer, and eventually transferred to Whitford's collection sometime in the early 1970s through a private acquisition Gerald had made. The production record listed it as non-saleable, which was a notation that had apparently not made it into the digital transfer when the physical archives were converted. There was no flag on it in the current inventory system. There was nothing to tell anyone it was anything other than a very old, very ruined Camaro. It was worth, conservatively, $380,000. In full restoration, it was worth more. He had sold it for $800. Dex drove to the garage on Brennan Street the next morning. He parked on the opposite side and watched for a few minutes before he got out. Then, he walked in through the open overhead door like someone who was expected. Brennan was at the workbench. He did not turn around immediately. "You got lucky on that bid," Dex said. "I'll give you $15,000. Clean title, no paperwork, and we're done." Brennan set down the part he was cleaning. He turned around. He looked at Dex with an expression that did not change. "It's not for sale." Dex waited a beat. "The vehicle left our facility under a documentation error. We have grounds to challenge the transfer. Do you have that in writing?" Dex did not answer. He left. 2 days later, Brennan received a notice from the city's Code Enforcement Division. A complaint had been filed regarding operation of a commercial automotive repair business in a zone classified as light industrial, not prohibited but requiring a specific permit that Brennan had not applied for because he had not known it was required. Operations were suspended pending permit review. Timeline: up to 30 days. He read the notice at the kitchen table that evening. Petra came home from school while he was still reading it. She dropped her backpack by the door and walked over and stood beside him and looked at the paper in his hand. She could read well for her age, which she had gotten from her mother. "Is it because of the car?" she said. He folded the notice and set it face down on the table. "Go do your homework." She didn't move for a moment. She looked at his face the way she always did when she was deciding whether to push further. Then she picked up her backpack and went to her room. He sat at the table alone. Outside, through the small window above the sink, the light was going orange in the way it did in late afternoon in this part of the city. The kind of light that made ordinary things look briefly significant. He sat there until it was gone. Lupe came to the garage on a Thursday, 16 days after the pickup. He brought a canvas bag with a zipper that he set on the workbench without explanation, while he looked at what Brennan had done with the Camaro in the time since they'd last spoken. The body panels were clean now, the rust converted and stabilized. The engine block was out and on a stand. The detail work had the quality that comes from someone who is not in a hurry, which is different from someone who moves slowly. It is the pace of someone who knows what each step is for. Then Lupe unzipped the bag. There were documents inside, printed emails, handwritten notes on yellow legal paper, photocopies of transfer authorizations with Dex's signature. He had a habit of keeping things. It had started not as suspicion, but as a general practice. He'd been in enough organizations to know that paper mattered when disputes happened. When the disputes actually arrived, he already had the record. He spread them on the workbench in chronological order and explained it. 18 months ago, the first vehicle had moved through the system. He had noticed the buyer was an LLC he didn't recognize, and had checked in this business you learned to check, and found the registered agent connected to Dex's family. He had assumed it was an isolated thing. Then, it happened again, and again. After the fourth vehicle, he wrote the email to Cora. He spent a long time on it, careful, specific, not accusatory in tone, just factual. He had the buyer's LLC name, the purchase prices, the estimated market values, the discrepancy. He sent it to Cora's company email address. She never responded. He sent a follow-up 2 weeks later. Nothing. He found out 6 months ago, from a conversation with the IT administrator who didn't realize why Lupe was asking, that incoming emails on Cora's account were filtered through a rule that routed certain keywords to a review folder, a system Dex had set up 18 months ago under the cover of spam filtering. The emails from Lupe had never reached her inbox. "Why bring this to me?" Brennan asked. Lupe looked at him steadily. "Because you're the only person in this situation who has nothing to lose by telling the truth." That evening, across the city, Cora was in a conference room with 3 people from the audit firm. They had been through the first pass of the disposal records and flagged 7 transactions for closer review. The total underpayment, the gap between what the vehicles had sold for and their assessed market value, was approximately $1.1 million. All 7 transactions had been authorized by the same person. She asked the lead auditor who had flagged the transactions. He said one of the purchase records had been brought to their attention by the buyer of the final vehicle. He said the buyer had information suggesting the last vehicle in particular was misclassified. She asked for the buyer's name. The auditor looked at his file. A Brennan Wick. She did not recognize the name. She wrote it down. The lead auditor from the firm came to the garage on a Tuesday morning. He was methodical, introduced himself, explained the scope of his review, asked about the transaction in a tone that was professional and not unkind. Brennan answered everything directly. Yes, he had placed the bid. Yes, he had known the vehicle's approximate value before he bid. The auditor's pen stopped. Did you have specific knowledge of the vehicle's provenance? Yes. Can you explain how? Brennan went to the workbench. He opened the bottom drawer and removed a folder. Inside was a printed enlargement of the photograph from the auction listing. On it, in red pen, he had circled 4 areas and labeled them the C-pillar angle, the roofline radius, the quarter panel proportion, and the partial VIN visible in shadow at the bottom of the frame. Next to the photograph was a second page, a handwritten analysis of the VIN fragment cross-referenced with production records he had pulled from a publicly accessible collector database. The analysis concluded with a probability assessment, 87% likelihood, of prototype DZ302 classification, pending physical VIN confirmation. At the bottom of the folder, beneath both pages, was a laminated certification card, Barrett-Jackson Authentication Division. The photograph on it was a younger version of the same face. The name on it was Brennan Wick. The auditor looked at the card for a long moment. He looked at Brennan. He wrote something in his notebook and closed it. That night, Cora sat alone at her desk at 9:45. The audit firm had sent a preliminary summary. Attached to the Brennan Wick transaction note was a scanned copy of the certification card and a brief professional background pulled from industry records. 11 years at Barrett-Jackson. Recognized in 2 trade publications. Left the industry 3 years ago without public explanation. She opened a browser and searched the name. There were articles, show coverage, a few quotes in automotive trade pieces. The most recent result was from 3 years ago. After that, nothing. She pulled up the security camera footage from the back lot. The timestamp read 7:43, 16 days ago. She watched the flatbed reverse in. She watched the man get out, sign the form, put it in his pocket. She watched him walk to the car and put his hand on the roof and run his eyes down the length of the body. She understood now what she had been watching. She closed her laptop. She got her keys. She drove across the city and parked on the street outside the garage and sat in the car for a moment before she got out. The overhead door was up. The light inside was the particular yellow of fluorescent bulbs, and in it, the Camaro's bare metal body caught a dull shine that made it look like something being recovered, rather than something abandoned. She walked to the door. Brennan was sitting at the workbench, reading something. He looked up. He did not look surprised. She told him she needed to understand what he knew, and when he'd known it. He answered everything plainly. She asked about the folder. He walked her through it, the photograph, the analysis, the VIN fragment. When she got to the certification card, she stopped for a moment. She asked why he hadn't said anything sooner. He looked at her. Nobody asked. She was quiet. Then, I'm asking now. He stood up. He went to the workbench and retrieved the folder that Lupe had left. He set it in front of her without comment. She read it at the workbench, standing, while Brennan went back to work on the engine stand across the garage. She read for about 20 minutes. When she got to the page documenting the email routing the specific filter Dex had created, the keywords that had flagged Lupe's messages, the folder they had been redirected to, she set the page down and stood with her hands flat on the workbench and looked at nothing for a moment. She looked up at Brennan. He was focused on the engine and did not look back. She drove home with the folder on the passenger seat. Cora called the meeting for 9 in the morning on a Thursday. She listed it on the calendar as a general operations review. She did not tell Dex what it was about. He arrived in a gray suit, the kind he wore for investor presentations. He came in talking light conversation with the board member nearest the door. A comment about the parking structure is the kind of ease that belongs to a man who has been in this room many times and intends to be in it many more. He sat at the end of the table nearest the door, which was where he always sat. Brennan sat in a chair along the wall. He was not at the table. He had a folder on his lap and a paper cup of coffee on the floor next to the chair. He did not look at Dex. Dex looked at him once, briefly, and then looked away. Cora opened the meeting without preamble. 7 transactions over 18 months. Total assessed underpayment against fair market value, $1.1 million. All 7 authorizations bearing the same signature, approved under a delegated authority arrangement that Cora herself had signed off on 2 years ago. She placed the audit summary in the center of the table and walked through it page by page, the listing dates, the bid windows, the sale prices, the independent market assessments the audit firm had commissioned. She did not editorialize. She read what was there. Dex listened with the specific attentiveness of someone who has already prepared their response. When she stopped, he spoke without hesitation. The valuations had been conservative, which was a documented approach to distressed condition assets and would hold up under scrutiny. The assessment team had known limitations he had flagged in quarterly reports. He could pull those reports if needed. The process had followed the authorization framework Cora had approved. He was not defensive. He was explanatory, which was more dangerous. He paused, and then said that there was another aspect worth examining. He looked at the board. He did not look at Brennan yet. He said that the final vehicle in the series had been purchased by someone with undisclosed prior knowledge of the asset's value. He said the bid window was 48 hours, and the starting price was set by his team before any outside party had access to the lot. He said that if someone with specialized knowledge had used that knowledge to acquire an asset below fair market value, that was a form of opportunistic acquisition that the company might have legal grounds to revisit. He looked at Brennan then. I think we should ask who's really under review here. The room stayed with him. 2 board members exchanged a glance. It was a good move. It redirected without acknowledging anything, and it put Brennan in the position of defending himself in a room full of people who didn't know him. Cora let the silence sit for 4 seconds. Then she said, "The emails, Dex." She placed the log sheet on the table in front of him. It was a single printed page, the IT system record of an email filter, with the creation date at the top, the routing criteria in the middle, the destination folder at the bottom. Lupe Sanders' address appeared in the criteria field as a keyword. Below that, 2 entries, 2 emails sent to Cora's inbox, both redirected on arrival, both sitting unread in a folder Cora had not known existed until 4 days ago. The creation date of the filter was 3 days before Lupe's first email. Dex looked at the page. He looked at it for long enough that looking at it became the thing everyone in the room noticed. He picked it up. He set it down. He looked at Brennan. His voice stayed even. He knew the vehicle's value before he bid. That's market manipulation. If we're discussing the integrity of these transactions, we should start there. Brennan reached into the folder on his lap. He removed a document tabbed, bound with a binder clip. He leaned forward and set it on the table and pushed it to the center without standing up. Page 3, he said. He sat back. He did not look at Dex. He did not look at the board. He looked at the paper cup on the floor next to his chair. The board member nearest the folder reached for it. She turned to page 3. She read it. She turned it so the member beside her could see. That member read it and did not pass it along. Instead, she looked up, first at the table, then at Dex. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when the argument is over. And no one has said so yet. Page 3 was the formal authentication report. It had been prepared by an independent specialist firm over 4 days, working from photographs, the physical VIN, and production documentation Brennan had located in a publicly accessible collector archive. It identified the vehicle as a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 prototype, DZ302 specification, 1 of 2 produced, retained in private collection from 1971. Current fair market value in unrestored condition, $380,000 to $420,000. With full professional restoration, $600,000 to $700,000. On the next page was the production record from the Whitver Heritage Archive, scanned from the physical file Gerald Whitver had kept. At the bottom, in Gerald's handwriting, "Do not sell. This one is different," someone at the table said, quietly. Gerald knew. No one answered that. No one needed to. The board member who had read it first set it down in the center of the table where everyone could see it. She looked at Dex. He was looking at the wall above the window, which was not the wall. It was just a direction that wasn't anyone's face. What had undone him was not greed, exactly. What had undone him was the limit of what he knew. He had spent 11 years in that building, understanding cars at the level most people do, competent, experienced, but not beyond a certain ceiling. He had known the Camaro was old and deteriorated. He had known old and deteriorated things could sometimes be sold for more than they were listed for. He had not known, could not have known with the knowledge he had, that what sat in the back lot was something Gerald Whitver had protected in a handwritten note for 50 years. Brennan had known in 30 seconds from a badly lit photograph. That was the distance between them, and it had just been made visible to everyone in the room. The LLC trace took the investigating firm 11 minutes. It was registered in Delaware through a service company, which was common enough, but the registered agent's filing listed a secondary contact, who was Dex's brother-in-law. The brother-in-law had purchased 6 vehicles over 18 months through the LLC. He had resold 5 of them. The 6th was still in a storage unit in New Jersey. The board voted 8-1. The single opposing vote was Dex's proxy seat, which he had held by board appointment for 6 years, and which no one had thought to revoke before the vote, an oversight that was corrected the following morning. The motion referred the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential securities fraud related to the misrepresentation of assets under an active investor acquisition process. That language had been suggested by Whitver's outside counsel, who joined the meeting by phone for the last 15 minutes and did not speak except to offer that single recommendation. Dex left without collecting anything from his office. His keycard was deactivated while he was in the elevator. Afterward, the room cleared quickly, the way rooms do when a long pressure releases. Board members gathered their things and spoke in low tones and did not linger. Cora stayed at the head of the table and watched them go. When the last person left, she sat alone for a moment in the room that still smelled like coffee and turned paper. Then she went to find Brennan. He was in the hallway by the elevator, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets. He had his folder under one arm. He looked like someone who had no particular place to be, which was different from looking like someone with nothing to do. Cora said the car was his, legally, entirely, without condition or complication. He nodded once. She looked at the floor for a moment. I watched them, in the lot, and I kept walking. You didn't know, he said. I should have asked. She looked up at him. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone withholding something, but the quiet of someone placing something in the right position before setting it down. Apology accepted, he said. The elevator arrived. Neither of them moved immediately. Then Brennan pressed the button for the lobby. Cora stepped in beside him. They rode down without speaking, which was not uncomfortable in the way silence between strangers is. It was the silence of 2 people who have said what needed saying and are now simply occupying the same space. In the lobby, Petra was sitting in a chair with her backpack on her lap, reading a book she had brought from school. When she saw her father come through the elevator doors, she closed the book and stood up. She looked past him at Cora, who had come out a step behind. Petra looked at the woman with the directness of a 7-year-old, who has not yet learned to disguise observation as something polite. Are you the one who owned the car before? Cora said. I was. Petra considered this. Daddy's making it beautiful again. Cora looked at the girl. She looked at Brennan. She did not have an answer, and she did not reach for one. The lapse permit had been issued that morning, processed with unusual speed, once the Code Enforcement Office learned that the original complaint had been filed by a party now under regulatory investigation. Brennan was back in the garage before 7. The engine was in. The bodywork was done. The interior was rebuilt from components he had sourced over 2 weeks, through collector networks he had not accessed in 3 years, calls to people who remembered him, who asked no questions about where he'd been. The paint was Fathom Green, mixed to match a color chip from Gerald Whitver's personal reference collection, which Loop had quietly retrieved from the archive room and brought to the garage in an envelope 3 days ago without being asked. At 6:42 in the morning, Brennan sat in the driver's seat with the key in the ignition. He had not started it yet. Lupe arrived at 7, which was not something they had discussed. He walked in and stood to the side and said nothing. Brennan turned the key. The first 2 attempts were short. The engine turned over but did not catch. The 3rd attempt brought it. The engine started with a sound that was not loud so much as it was present a deep idle that vibrated in the door, and the column, and the floor, a sound that had not been in this building for 14 years, and that arrived now without announcement, and filled the space entirely. Brennan sat with both hands on the wheel. He let it idle. Lupe stood without moving. Neither man said anything. There was nothing to say that the sound wasn't already saying. Petra arrived at 7:30, dropped off by a neighbor. She came through the overhead door and stopped completely when she heard the engine. She looked at the car, looked at her father sitting in it. Her jacket fell off one shoulder and she didn't notice. Brennan opened the passenger door from inside. She walked over and got in. She sat very straight, hands on her knees, and looked through the windshield at the early morning light coming through the open door. In it, the fathom green paint was the color of deep water and old trees. Cora arrived at 8. She had not been invited. She parked on the street and walked to the open door and stood at the threshold. Lupe picked up his coffee cup and went outside to stand on the sidewalk, his way of saying something without saying it. Cora walked in. She stood beside the car and ran her hand along the rear quarter panel, the one she had signed away for $800. She looked at it for a long time. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You already gave me one," Brennan said. "In the hallway." "That was in a hallway." She looked at him. "This is in front of the car." He held her gaze for a moment. Apology accepted. Petra was watching Cora from the passenger seat, with the same open patience she'd had in the lobby 2 days ago. Brennan looked at his daughter. He looked at Cora. "You want to come?" Cora looked at the car. She looked at Petra, who was waiting with complete calm. For the first time in 21 days, and perhaps longer than that, Cora smiled in a way she had not planned. She opened the rear door and got in. Brennan backed the Camaro slowly out into the morning light. On the sidewalk, Lupe watched it go. He didn't wave. He just watched, until the green car turned the corner at the end of the block and was gone. He hadn't gone looking for a second chance. He'd gone looking for a car. It turned out they were the same thing.